In the annals of English royal history, few deaths have sparked as much debate, horror, and fascination as that of King Edward II in 1327. What happened behind the stone walls of Berkeley Castle on that September night remains one of the most chilling mysteries of medieval England. The official records speak of natural causes, yet whispered accounts tell of something far more sinister, a death so brutal and symbolic that it was designed not just to end a life, but to send a message that would echo through the centuries. Edward Plantagenet was born to inherit one of Europe's most powerful thrones, yet he died as a prisoner in his own kingdom, abandoned by his nobles, betrayed by his wife, and despised by many of his subjects. His reign, marked by military disasters and personal scandals, culminated in a downfall so complete that even his manner of death became a weapon wielded by his enemies. The story you're about to hear challenges everything you thought you knew about medieval justice, royal power, and the lengths to which people will go to erase a legacy they despise. The methods allegedly used to end Edward's life were not chosen randomly. They were calculated, symbolic, and designed to reflect what his enemies saw as his greatest sins. But separating historical fact from political propaganda in this case requires us to navigate through layers of rumor, chronicler accounts, and deliberate misinformation that have obscured the truth for nearly 7 centuries. What emerges is a tale that reveals as much about medieval attitudes toward power, sexuality, and punishment as it does about one king's tragic end. This is not merely the story of how a king died, but of how power can corrupt, how personal relationships can topple kingdoms, and how the pursuit of revenge can lead to acts of unimaginable cruelty. As we delve into the final chapter of Edward II's life, we'll explore not just what may have happened in that castle cell, but why it happened, who was responsible, and what it tells us about an age where political murder was both an art and a statement. The truth about Edward II's death is more complex and more horrifying than the simple narrative of a deposed king meeting his end. It's a story that forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, sexuality, and the price of absolute power, questions that remain disturbingly relevant even today. To understand the horror of Edward II's final moments, we must first comprehend the man he was and the world that shaped him. Born in 1284 as the 4th son of the formidable Edward I known as Longshanks, young Edward grew up in the shadow of one of England's most successful warrior kings. His father had conquered Wales, dominated Scotland, and established England as a formidable military power. The expectation was that Edward would continue this legacy of strength and conquest, but from his earliest years, it became clear that he was cut from very different cloth. Medieval England in the early 14th century was a society built on rigid hierarchies and uncompromising expectations of royal behavior. Kings were expected to be warriors first, leading their armies into battle and expanding their territories through conquest. They were to be pious Christians, dutiful husbands, and fathers who could secure the royal succession. Personal relationships, particularly those that might be seen as inappropriate or politically disadvantageous, were subordinated to the needs of the crown and the kingdom. Edward's problems began almost immediately upon his accession to the throne in 1307. Unlike his father, who had earned respect through military victories and strong governance, Edward II seemed more interested in his personal relationships and leisure activities than in the demanding work of kingship. His deep friendship with a Gascon knight named Piers Gaveston became the source of immediate controversy, not merely because of its intensity, but because Edward elevated Gaveston to positions of power that outraged the established nobility. The political structure of medieval England depended on a delicate balance between royal authority and noble privilege. The great barons expected to be consulted on matters of state, to hold the most important offices, and to benefit from royal patronage. When Edward instead lavished titles, lands, and influence upon Gaveston, a foreigner of relatively modest birth, he upset this fundamental arrangement. The Earl of Cornwall, one of England's most prestigious titles, was granted to Gaveston, along with vast estates and the king's obvious favour in all matters. What made this situation even more explosive was the nature of Edward and Gaveston's relationship itself. Medieval chroniclers, writing with varying degrees of hostility toward the king, described their bond in terms that contemporaries found deeply troubling. Whether their relationship was romantic, as many historians now believe, or simply an unusually intense friendship, it violated medieval expectations of how a king should conduct himself. In an age where royal marriages were diplomatic tools and personal desires were expected to be subordinated to political necessity, Edward's obvious devotion to Gaveston appeared to many as a dangerous weakness that threatened the stability of the realm. The crisis deepened when Edward's military campaigns began to fail spectacularly. His father had left him ongoing conflicts in Scotland, where Robert the Bruce was fighting for Scottish independence. Instead of the swift victories that might have restored confidence in his leadership, Edward suffered a series of humiliating defeats. The most devastating was the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, where a significantly smaller Scottish force routed the English army, capturing numerous nobles and dealing a blow to English prestige from which Edward never recovered. Bannockburn was more than just a military defeat. It was a catastrophic failure of leadership that exposed Edward's fundamental inadequacies as a warrior king. Medieval warfare was as much about royal presence and inspiration as it was about tactics and numbers. A king who could not lead his forces to victory, who appeared indecisive or weak in the face of the enemy, lost not just battles, but the essential mystique of royal authority. Edward's nobles began to see him not as their divinely appointed leader, but as an obstacle to England's success and security. The aftermath of Bannockburn saw the emergence of organized noble opposition to Edward's rule. Led by his own cousin, Thomas of Lancaster, a group of powerful barons began to impose increasingly severe restrictions on the king's authority. They demanded the right to approve royal appointments, control royal finances, and essentially reduce Edward to a figurehead. This conflict was not simply about policy disagreements, it was about whether Edward II was fit to rule at all. The situation became even more volatile with the king's marriage to Isabella of France in 1308. Initially arranged as a diplomatic alliance to strengthen ties between England and France, the marriage began promisingly enough. Isabella was intelligent, beautiful, and politically astute, exactly the kind of queen who might have helped stabilize Edward's troubled reign. She bore him 4 children, including the future Edward III, seemingly fulfilling her primary duty as a royal wife. However, Isabella's position became increasingly difficult as Edward's relationship with his favorites continued to dominate court life. After Gaveston's eventual execution by hostile nobles in 1312, Edward formed similarly intense relationships with other men, most notably Hugh Despenser the Younger. The Despensers, father and son, became even more powerful and more hated than Gaveston had been, essentially ruling England through their influence over the king while accumulating vast wealth and estates for themselves. For Isabella, watching her husband lavish attention, affection, and resources on his male favorites while neglecting his royal duties and his marriage, the situation became unbearable. She was not merely a jealous wife, she was a queen whose political position and personal dignity were being systematically undermined by Edward's behavior. The French court, where she had grown up, viewed the English situation with increasing alarm and contempt, seeing Edward's reign as a disgrace to royal dignity and an insult to their daughter. The breaking point came in the mid-1320s when Isabella, during a diplomatic mission to France, refused to return to England. Instead, She began an open affair with Roger Mortimer, an exiled English baron who had his own reasons for wanting revenge against Edward II. Mortimer had been imprisoned in the Tower of London, but had escaped to France, where he and Isabella began planning what would become one of history's most successful palace coups. Their relationship was both personal and political. Isabella found in Mortimer the kind of strong, decisive man she had hoped to find in her husband, while Mortimer saw in Isabella the perfect vehicle for his return to power in England. Together, they began assembling an invasion force, gathering support from disaffected English nobles and preparing to overthrow Edward II by force. The Queen had transformed from a neglected wife into the leader of a revolution against her own husband. The invasion of 1326 was swift and devastating. Isabella and Mortimer landed in Suffolk with a small force, but Edward's regime collapsed almost immediately. Years of resentment against the Despensers and disgust with Edward's rule meant that few were willing to fight for the king. Noble after noble declared for Isabella, and Edward found himself with virtually no support. The Despensers were captured and executed with extreme brutality. Hugh Despenser the Younger was hanged, drawn, and quartered, but not before being subjected to additional tortures that reflected the rage his rule had generated. Edward himself fled westward, trying to reach Wales or Ireland where he might find refuge, but he was captured near the Welsh border in November 1326. The man who had once been one of Europe's most powerful monarchs was now a prisoner, wholly at the mercy of those he had alienated through years of misrule. His capture marked not just the end of his reign, but the beginning of a carefully orchestrated campaign to destroy him completely, not just as a king, but as a man. The deposition of Edward II was unprecedented in English history. Never before had a king been formally removed from the throne while still alive, and the process required careful legal and political maneuvering to create even a semblance of legitimacy. Isabella and Mortimer, now ruling in the name of Edward's young son, the future Edward III, had to walk a delicate line between appearing to act legally while ensuring that Edward could never threaten their position again. Parliament was summoned in January 1327, though it was hardly a free deliberation. With Mortimer's supporters controlling London and Edward imprisoned, the assembled nobles and clergy were presented with a stark choice: formally depose Edward II or face the consequences of opposing the new regime. The charges against Edward were devastating: incompetence, failure to defend the realm, allowing favorites to rule in his place, and bringing dishonor to the crown. While these accusations contained substantial truth, the process was essentially a show trial designed to provide legal cover for what was fundamentally a successful coup. The most innovative aspect of the deposition was its claim to represent the will of the entire kingdom. Rather than simply being a palace revolution, Isabella and Mortimer insisted that they were acting on behalf of all England, nobles, clergy and commons, to remove an unfit king and replace him with someone capable of proper rule. This was a radical constitutional development that would have lasting implications for English governance, establishing precedents for parliamentary involvement in royal succession that would resurface in later centuries. Edward's formal abdication was secured through a combination of legal pressure and implied threats. Representatives were sent to Kenilworth Castle, where he was being held, to inform him of Parliament's decision and demand his formal renunciation of the crown. The scene, as recorded by chroniclers, was pathetic. The former king, now dressed in simple black clothing, wept as he agreed to surrender his throne to his son. Whether this abdication was genuinely voluntary or extracted under duress remains a matter of historical debate, but the practical reality was that Edward had no choice. The new government faced a fundamental problem: what to do with the deposed king. Simply releasing him was impossible. He would always represent a potential rallying point for opposition to the new regime. Keeping him imprisoned indefinitely was politically dangerous and expensive. There were precedents in other kingdoms for dealing with inconvenient former rulers, but none that exactly matched Edward's situation. The solution they eventually adopted was both subtle and sinister. Edward was moved from Kenilworth to Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire, ostensibly for reasons of security and cost. Berkeley was owned by Thomas de Berkeley, a baron whose family had suffered under Edward's rule and who could be trusted to ensure the former king remained safely confined. The choice of Berkeley was not accidental. It was remote enough to prevent rescue attempts, secure enough to prevent escape, and controlled by someone with personal reasons to hate Edward II. The conditions of Edward's imprisonment at Berkeley were deliberately harsh. Gone were the comforts appropriate to his royal birth. Instead, he was kept in a cell designed to break his spirit and undermine his health. The psychological warfare was as important as the physical constraints. Edward was to be stripped not just of his crown and freedom, but of his dignity and hope. Every aspect of his daily existence was calculated to remind him of his fall from grace and his complete dependence on his captor's mercy. According to some contemporary accounts, the conditions at Berkeley were designed to kill Edward slowly while maintaining plausible deniability about the cause of his death. The cell was allegedly positioned above the castle's sewers, exposing him to disease and foul air. His food was poor and irregular, his bedding inadequate, and his treatment deliberately humiliating. If he died of illness or despair, his captors could claim that they had simply been holding him as instructed, with no intention of causing his death. However, this gradual approach to Edward's elimination apparently proved too slow for those in power. By the summer of 1327, political pressures were mounting for a more permanent solution to the problem of the deposed king. Rumors were circulating about possible rescue attempts, and foreign courts were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about Edward's treatment. Isabella and Mortimer needed Edward to die, but they needed his death to appear natural, or at least not obviously murderous. The decision to move from passive to active measures against Edward's life marked a crucial turning point in this dark chapter of English history. What happened next at Berkeley Castle would become one of the most debated and horrifying episodes in the medieval chronicles, a story so brutal and symbolic that many historians have questioned whether it could possibly be true. Yet the evidence suggests that something truly terrible occurred in that castle cell, something that reflected not just the desire to eliminate a political enemy, but to send a message about the consequences of violating medieval expectations of royal behavior. The summer of 1327 brought increasing pressure on Isabella and Mortimer to resolve the problem of Edward II permanently. Foreign courts, particularly in France and the Holy Roman Empire, were beginning to ask pointed questions about the former king's treatment. Pope John XXV had expressed concern about Edward's welfare, and there were persistent rumors of plots to rescue him from Berkeley Castle. More troubling still were reports that some English nobles were having second thoughts about the deposition, wondering whether they had gone too far in removing an anointed king from his throne. The political calculus was brutal, but clear. Edward II, alive, would always be a threat to the new regime. As long as he lived, he remained the legitimate king in the eyes of many, regardless of his formal abdication. His son, Edward III, was still a minor, which meant that Isabella and Mortimer's power depended entirely on their ability to prevent any restoration of the deposed king. They had crossed a line that made reconciliation impossible. They had to see their coup through to its logical conclusion, no matter how dark that conclusion might be. The solution that emerged was characteristic of medieval political murder, in its combination of deniability and symbolism. Edward could not simply be stabbed or poisoned in an obvious manner. Such a death would make martyrs of him, and potentially provoke rebellion among those who still felt loyalty to the legitimate royal line. Instead, his death needed to appear natural, while simultaneously serving as a warning to others about the consequences of challenging the new order. Contemporary chroniclers, writing years or even decades after the events, provide conflicting accounts of what exactly happened at Berkeley Castle in September 1327. Some simply state that Edward died of natural causes, overcome by grief and poor treatment. Others hint at more sinister circumstances without providing details. But the most detailed and disturbing accounts describe a death so horrific and symbolically loaded that it seems designed not just to end Edward's life, but to destroy his reputation and terrify his potential supporters. The most widely reported version of Edward's death involves a method of execution that was both brutally effective and deeply symbolic. According to these accounts, the former king was held down by his guards while a red-hot iron rod was inserted into his body through his rectum, burning his internal organs and causing an agonizing death that left no external marks of violence. This method would allow his killers to claim that he had died of natural causes while ensuring that his death was as painful and humiliating as possible. The symbolic nature of this alleged method of execution cannot be overlooked. In medieval thinking, punishments were often designed to reflect the nature of the crime, and Edward's supposed homosexual relationships with his favorites had scandalized his contemporaries. If the accounts are accurate, his death was crafted as the ultimate expression of contempt for what his enemies saw as his sexual transgressions and his failure to embody proper masculine royal authority. The practicalities of such an execution would have required careful planning and the complicity of multiple individuals. The iron would need to be heated to the right temperature, the victim restrained effectively, and the act carried out with sufficient skill to achieve its purpose while leaving minimal evidence. This was not a crime of passion or a spur-of-the-moment decision. It would have been a calculated act of political terrorism, designed to send a message about the consequences of crossing Isabella and Mortimer. The timing of Edward's death on September 21st, 1327, was announced with suspicious promptness to the new government in London. The official cause was given as natural death due to grief and illness, and elaborate funeral arrangements were quickly made to demonstrate the new regime's respect for royal dignity. Edward's body was displayed publicly before burial, reportedly showing no obvious signs of violence, which would be consistent with the alleged method of his murder. The reaction to news of Edward's death varied dramatically depending on one's political position. Isabella and Mortimer expressed appropriate grief while privately celebrating the removal of their greatest threat. Supporters of the old regime whispered about murder, but dared not speak openly. The common people, who had suffered under Edward's misrule, but retained some respect for royal authority, were confused and troubled by the rapid sequence of events that had seen their king deposed, imprisoned, and dead within less than a year. What makes the story of Edward's death particularly chilling is not just the brutality of the alleged method, but the cold calculation that it represents. This was not a crime committed in hot blood or desperation. It was political murder elevated to the level of performance art, designed to destroy not just a man, but the very idea of him. The symbolism was as important as the practical result, serving notice to anyone who might challenge the new order about what they could expect if they failed. The immediate aftermath of Edward II's death revealed the careful planning that had gone into this final act of his tragedy. Within hours of the announcement, messengers were dispatched throughout England, carrying the news to sheriffs, nobles, and church authorities. The speed and coordination of this communication suggested that the death had been anticipated and prepared for, rather than being the sudden natural event that the official accounts claimed. Berkeley Castle itself became a carefully managed crime scene. Thomas de Berkeley, the castle's owner, immediately distanced himself from any responsibility for Edward's death, claiming that he had been absent from the castle at the crucial time. This convenient absence was almost certainly planned in advance, providing Berkeley with plausible deniability while ensuring that someone of sufficient authority was available to oversee Edward's final moments. The other individuals present at the castle, guards, servants, and officials, were either sworn to secrecy or eliminated as potential witnesses. The preparation of Edward's body for public display represented another crucial element in the cover-up. Medieval embalming techniques were primitive, but they were sufficient to preserve a corpse for the several weeks needed to organize a royal funeral. More importantly, the embalming process would destroy much of the internal evidence of the alleged torture, making it virtually impossible for anyone to challenge the official cause of death through examination of the remains. The funeral itself was a masterpiece of political theater, designed to demonstrate Isabella and Mortimer's legitimate grief, while reinforcing their authority as protectors of royal dignity. Edward's body was carried from Berkeley to Gloucester Cathedral with appropriate ceremony, drawing crowds of observers who could see for themselves that the former king showed no obvious signs of violence. The elaborate tomb, erected for him, which still exists today, proclaimed him as a legitimate king who had died naturally, not as a murder victim. Perhaps most telling was the treatment of those most directly involved in Edward's final imprisonment. Within months of his death, several of the guards and officials at Berkeley Castle met suspicious ends themselves, some dying in accidents, others disappearing entirely, and still others being found dead under circumstances that suggested they knew too much about what had really happened. This systematic elimination of witnesses represents the final phase of the cover-up, ensuring that the truth about Edward's death died with those who had witnessed it. The broader political consequences of Edward's death unfolded exactly as Isabella and Mortimer had planned. With the former king permanently eliminated, opposition to the new regime collapsed. The young Edward III was crowned with appropriate ceremony, but real power remained firmly in the hands of his mother and her lover. For several years, their rule appeared secure, justified by the removal of an incompetent king and the installation of what appeared to be a more effective government. However, the very brutality that made Edward's murder politically effective also contained the seeds of Isabella and Mortimer's eventual downfall. The whispered stories about what had really happened at Berkeley Castle created an undercurrent of revulsion and fear that gradually undermined their authority. Many who had supported the deposition of Edward II began to question whether they had unleashed forces too dark and dangerous to control. The line between necessary political action and unforgivable cruelty had been crossed, and the moral authority of the new regime was permanently compromised. The international reaction to Edward's death was more muted than might have been expected, partly because most foreign courts were relieved to see England's political crisis resolved, and partly because the official story of natural death was difficult to challenge without concrete evidence. However, private correspondence between royal courts reveals considerable suspicion about the true circumstances of Edward's end, and this suspicion affected England's diplomatic relationships for years to come. Most significantly, the young Edward III absorbed lessons from his father's fate that would shape his own approach to kingship. As he grew older and began to assert his own authority, he demonstrated none of his father's weakness or indecision. His eventual overthrow of Isabella and Mortimer in 1330 was swift and decisive, suggesting that he had learned both from his father's failures and from the methods used to destroy him. The brutality that had eliminated Edward II ultimately created the conditions for its own punishment. The question of whether Edward II was really murdered in the horrific manner described by some chroniclers has fascinated historians for centuries. The evidence is contradictory and politically motivated, making definitive conclusions impossible. What we can say with certainty is that powerful people wanted Edward dead. that he died under suspicious circumstances while in their custody, and that the official explanations were designed more to protect the perpetrators than to reveal the truth. Some modern historians argue that the entire story of Edward's brutal murder was a later invention, designed to blacken the reputations of Isabella and Mortimer after their own downfall. According to this theory, Edward may have died naturally or been killed in a more conventional manner, with the horrific details added later by chroniclers who wanted to emphasize the evil of the usurpers. The symbolic nature of the alleged execution method, so perfectly designed to reflect medieval attitudes about Edward's supposed sexual transgressions, does seem almost too neat to be historical fact. However, other evidence supports the darker interpretation of events. The systematic elimination of witnesses, the careful management of Edward's death scene, and the political benefits that his murder provided to Isabella and Mortimer all suggest that something more sinister than natural death occurred at Berkeley Castle. The fact that similar execution methods were used in other medieval political murders lends credibility to the accounts, even if the specific details may have been embellished over time. Perhaps the most compelling argument for the murder theory lies in the political logic of the situation. Isabella and Mortimer had committed themselves to a course of action that made Edward's continued existence impossible. They had deposed an anointed king, seized power in the name of his minor son, and eliminated Edward's supporters through execution and exile. In such circumstances, allowing Edward to live would have been not just politically dangerous, but suicidal. They had gone too far to turn back. The method allegedly used to kill Edward, if accurate, reveals a level of psychological sophistication that speaks to the medieval understanding of power, shame, and symbolic justice. This was not simply murder, but a carefully crafted statement about the consequences of violating societal norms. Edward's supposed homosexual relationships had scandalized his contemporaries, and his death was designed to reflect and punish those transgressions in the most brutal way possible. What makes this case particularly disturbing is the way it combines personal revenge with political necessity. Isabella's motivations were not purely political. She had been personally humiliated by Edward's neglect and his obvious preference for male favorites over his wife and queen. The alleged method of his execution suggests a degree of personal vindictiveness that goes beyond mere political calculation, reflecting the rage of a woman who had been systematically degraded and ignored by the man who was supposed to honor and protect her. The legacy of Edward II's death extends far beyond the immediate political consequences of 1327. The story, whether factual or legendary, became part of English folklore and political consciousness, serving as a warning about the dangers of weak kingship and the consequences of violating social norms. It established precedents for the deposition of kings that would resurface during later constitutional crises, particularly during the English Civil War and the eventual execution of Charles III. The case also reveals the medieval relationship between sexuality, power, and political legitimacy in ways that remain uncomfortable and relevant today. Edward's downfall was not simply about his failures as a military leader or administrator. It was about his perceived failure to embody proper masculine authority and his apparent preference for relationships that violated contemporary social expectations. His death, real or imagined, was designed to punish not just political incompetence, but sexual transgression. For modern audiences, the story of Edward II's death raises difficult questions about the nature of historical truth and the ways in which political propaganda can shape our understanding of the past. The accounts of his brutal murder may be factual records of a horrific crime, or they may be later inventions designed to justify the actions of his son, Edward III, and blacken the reputations of Isabella and Mortimer. The truth may be forever lost in the maze of medieval politics and propaganda, What remains clear is that Edward II's fate serves as a stark reminder of the costs of political failure in an age where power was personal, absolute, and unforgiving. Whether he died naturally, was murdered conventionally, or suffered the brutal end described by the chroniclers, his death marked the end of one of the most tragic reigns in English history and opened a new chapter in the long struggle between royal authority and noble resistance. The shadow cast by Edward II's death extended far beyond his own lifetime, influencing English politics and royal behavior for generations to come. The very possibility that a king could be not just deposed, but murdered in such a brutal and symbolic manner fundamentally altered the relationship between ruler and ruled. No longer could kings assume that their divine appointment protected them from the ultimate consequences of political failure. The precedent had been set that even anointed royalty could face death if they sufficiently alienated their subjects. Edward III, who inherited the throne as a result of his father's deposition and death, learned these lessons well. His reign became one of military glory and administrative competence, marked by victories in France and Scotland that restored English prestige and demonstrated the kind of warrior kingship that his father had so conspicuously failed to provide. Whether consciously or not, Edward III's success represented a systematic repudiation of everything his father had stood for, proving that the Plantagenet line could produce effective rulers when guided by the harsh lessons of Edward II's failure. The political innovations that accompanied Edward II's deposition, particularly the involvement of Parliament in removing a king and the claim that such actions could represent the will of the entire kingdom, established constitutional precedents that would echo through English history. The idea that kingship was conditional upon effective rule, rather than being an absolute divine right, took root in English political consciousness and would eventually contribute to the development of constitutional monarchy centuries later. Isabella herself, despite her initial success in eliminating Edward II, ultimately paid a heavy price for her role in his death. When Edward III came of age and asserted his own authority, one of his first acts was to arrest and execute Roger Mortimer, while confining his mother to comfortable but permanent retirement from politics. The official charges against Mortimer included the murder of Edward II, suggesting that even the new king believed his father had been murdered rather than having died naturally. The international ramifications of Edward's death were equally significant. Other European courts took note of how quickly and completely an established king could fall when he lost the support of his nobles and his people. The brutal efficiency of Edward's elimination served as both an inspiration and a warning to other rulers facing domestic opposition, demonstrating that in the medieval world, political failure could have the most extreme personal consequences. Perhaps most importantly, the story of Edward II's death became embedded in English cultural memory as a cautionary tale about the dangers of weak leadership and inappropriate personal relationships. Whether the horrific details of his alleged murder were factual or not, they served a powerful symbolic function, reinforcing social norms about masculine authority, royal duty, and the consequences of violating established expectations. The story became a part of the collective unconscious of English political culture, shaping attitudes toward leadership and authority for centuries to come. The mystery surrounding the exact circumstances of Edward's death has proven to be as politically useful as the death itself. The uncertainty allows each generation to interpret the story according to their own values and political needs, making Edward II's fate a kind of historical Rorschach test that reveals as much about those who tell the story as about the events themselves. Medieval chroniclers used it to justify the actions of Edward III. Reformation writers employed it to criticize papal interference in English affairs. Modern historians debate it as a question of evidence and interpretation. What cannot be disputed is that Edward II's death marked the end of one of the most tragic and instructive reigns in English history. His story serves as a reminder that in the medieval world, personal and political failure could have consequences of unimaginable brutality. Whether he died naturally, was murdered conventionally, or suffered the horrific fate described by contemporary chroniclers, his end represents the ultimate price of political inadequacy in an age where power was personal, absolute, and utterly unforgiving. The final lesson of Edward II's death may be that the truth about historical events matters less than the stories we tell about them. The accounts of his brutal murder, whether factual or fabricated, served important political and social functions for those who told them. They warned of the consequences of weak kingship, reinforced social norms about appropriate royal behavior, and provided justification for the actions of those who came after. In this sense, the story of Edward's death became more powerful than the death itself, shaping English political culture in ways that extended far beyond the walls of Berkeley Castle and the brief life of one failed king. Today, nearly 7 centuries after that September night in 1327, we still grapple with the questions raised by Edward II's fate. How far can political opposition legitimately go? What are the proper limits of resistance to authority? When does necessary change become inexcusable brutality? These questions, as relevant now as they were in medieval England, ensure that the dark story of Edward II's death continues to resonate with modern audiences, serving as both historical lesson and timeless warning about the nature of power, its uses, and its terrible consequences when it goes wrong.